The studio lights bathed the late show set in a crisp golden hue, the atmosphere crackling with a subtle buzz as Stephen Colbert settled behind his desk. His grin wide but his gaze keen, a host poised for the unexpected. Across from him sat Ezra Klein, the journalist and commentator whose sharp intellect and measured tone had earned him a reputation for cutting through noise. His posture calm yet alert, like a debater ready to parry. The audience, a mix of late-night regulars and political junkies, rustled with curiosity, sensing the potential for a lively exchange between Colbert's wit and Klein's analysis. What started as a routine interview soon flared into a first storm. A clash sparked by a single stunning remark that would end with Klein storming off, leaving Colbert to hold the stage. Colbert kicked off with his trademark charm, tossing out a playful jab about Klein's latest, a piece dissecting a polarizing tax reform proposal that had split the nation's discourse. His tone was light, inviting Klein to unpack the policy stakes. But beneath the humor lay a pointed curiosity, a nudge toward the deeper fault lines. Klein leaned in, his voice steady as he outlined the plan's flaws, arguing it favored the elite at the expense of the vulnerable. His words precise, almost clinical. Colbert nodded, then pivoted, his questions growing bolder, pressing Klein on the feasibility of alternatives, the messy reality of political will. Was this critique grounded, or just ivory tower idealism? Who got to draw the line between justice and pragmatism? The air thickened as Colbert shifted gears, probing Klein's broader take on power, his lens on a system he'd spent years dissecting. He brought up recent headlines, a wave of public outrage over wealth gaps, and asked Klein to connect the dots, his tone sharpening with each word. Klein didn't flinch, his response measured but firm, until he dropped a bombshell. He called the current political class, both sides, a cabal more loyal to donors than voters. A line so blunt, it sucked the air from the room. Colbert's eyebrows shot up, his laugh a mix of surprise and delight. But he pressed harder, questioning if Klein's idealism blinded him to the game's rules. Did he really believe the system could bend? Or was he just shouting into the wind? The crowd murmured, some cheering, others tensing, as the exchange turned raw. By the first break, the stage simmered with a restless heat. Klein's calm had frayed, his fingers gripping the armrest, his eyes narrowing as if recalculating his stance. Colbert, meanwhile, leaned forward, his wit now a spark in a dry field, each quip stoking the tension. What had been a policy chat had cracked open a chasm, Klein's bold claim clashing with Colbert's relentless pushback. The audience caught in the crossfire. The room felt it. This wasn't just debate. It was a collision of conviction and challenge. Could Klein hold his ground? Or would Colbert's pressure break him? As the light dimmed, the stakes loomed large. The confrontation poised to ignite. The commercial break ended, and the late show studio snapped back into focus, the air heavy with a tension that had only deepened in the pause. A palpable hum threading through the space. Stephen Colbert sat at his desk, his posture still loose but his eyes now sharp with intent. A host who'd sensed blood in the water and wasn't about to let it slip away. Ezra Klein faced him, his earlier composure strained, his hands clasped tightly, his jaw set as if bracing for impact. The audience, their murmurs hushed into a taut stillness, leaned forward, their anticipation a living pulse. Every breath held as they watched the clash unfold. What had simmered before the break now burst into flames. A confrontation driven by Klein's incendiary words that would push him to the edge and send him storming off, leaving Colbert to seize the night. Colbert dove back in with a grin that bide the steel beneath, his voice smooth as he circled back to Klein's bombshell. The accusation that politicians were a donor-driven cabal, a claim that still hung in the air like smoke. He didn't let it settle, instead pressing Klein to name names, to back up the charge with something concrete, his tone a mix of skepticism and goading delight. Klein hesitated, then doubled down, his voice rising as he pointed to recent lobbying scandals, tax breaks that reeked of favoritism, his words a flood of frustration that painted a system rotten at its core. Colbert's laugh cut through, sharp and quick, as he countered with a jab at Klein's naivety, asking if he thought outrage alone could dismantle decades of entrenched power. The exchange surged, a verbal sparring match that grew hotter with each volley, the stage a battlefield of ideas and egos. Colbert leaned forward, his questions relentless, probing Klein's vision for reform, tearing at the edges of his argument. With a comedian's knack for finding weak spots, he brought up the public's apathy, the gridlock of Congress, suggesting Klein's critique was a lecture. From a perch too lofty to touch reality. Klein's face flushed, his retort biting, accusing Colbert of trivializing a crisis for laughs, of playing court jester while the house burned. The crowd gasped, some cheering, others stunned, as Klein's words turned personal, his calm unraveling into a raw edge. That caught even Colbert off guard. The breaking point hit like a thunderclap, the tension shattering as Colbert, voice climbing, challenged Klein's sanctimony, asking if he'd ever dirted his hands in the fight he preached about, or if he just pontificated from the sidelines. Klein shot to his feet, his chair scraping back with a harsh screech, his restraint gone as he ripped off his mic, the cord dangling like a snapped tether. He unleashed a barrage, his voice booming through the studio, calling Colbert a smug gatekeeper, a hypocrite who mocked the powerless while cozying up to the elite. The audience froze, their silence deafening. As Klein's tirade spiraled, his anger a mix of betrayal and defiance, accusing the host of twisting his words into a circus. Colbert stood too, his stance unwavering, shouting back that Klein couldn't handle the heat of his own fire, that running didn't prove his point. Klein didn't waver, his glare fierce as he turned and strode off stage, his footsteps echoing in the stunned hush, disappearing into the wings. As the crowd erupted, a chaotic swell of cheers and murmurs swallowing the moment, the dust of Ezra's exit still hung in the Late Show studio as the lights flared back to life, the audience caught in a maelstrom of shock and adrenaline, their voices a low roar that rippled through the seats. Stephen Colbert stood behind his desk, his breath steadying, his face a mask of resolve tinged with a flicker of surprise at the intensity of what had just unfolded. The crew scurried in the shadows, their headsets alive with urgent whispers, their movements a frantic counterpoint to the crowd's stunned energy. Some clapping wildly, others staring wide-eyed, all grappling with the raw drama they'd witnessed. Klein's departure had cracked the night wide open, and Colbert, ever the maestro, turned the chaos into a stage for his own command, a triumph that would resonate long after the cameras stopped rolling. Backstage, the scene was a whirlwind, a frenzy of motion and muffled chaos as Klein's exit sent shockwaves through the production. Staffers darted through corridors, phones buzzing with texts from producers desperate to assess the damage, their voices overlapping in a rush of disbelief and strategy. Word trickled out fast. Klein hadn't just left the set, he'd stormed past the green room, brushing off a handler's pleas, his coat slung over his arm as he made for the street, his face a storm of frustration. Insiders murmured he'd been rattled even before the taping, pacing nervously, scribbling notes, his nerves frayed by the weight of his own bold stance. Colbert's unyielding pressure had lit the fuse, and Klein's eruption was less a planned stand and more a breaking point. A man pushed beyond his limit by a host who wouldn't relent. On stage, Colbert seized the moment with a deftness that silenced the room, his voice cutting through the clamor as he turned to the audience, his grin returning, sly and knowing. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, instead launching into a riff that spun Klein's meltdown into a biting reflection. His tone a blend of humor and steel, he recapped the clash with a storyteller's precision, replaying Klein's bombshell about the political cabal, the way it had landed like a grenade, then the fury that followed. The mic hitting the floor with a thud that still echoed in their ears. The crowd leaned in, their tension easing into laughter, then cheers, as Colbert framed Klein as a thinker who'd cracked under the glare. A man whose ideals couldn't withstand the spotlight he'd courted. He lingered on the exit, the stomping retreat, painting it as a lesson in hubris with a comedian's deft touch. The segment became a showcase, Colbert weaving the night's rupture into a narrative of accountability, his wit a thread that stitched the chaos into something purposeful. He mocked the outburst's theatrics, likening it to a pundit's tantrum in a debate gone sour, then pivoted to the stakes beneath, the danger of preaching without facing the fire. The audience roared, their earlier unease replaced by a visceral connection, their applause a wave that crashed through the studio, affirming Colbert's grip on the moment. He didn't overplay it, didn't lean on cheap victory laps, instead letting the story breathe, his pauses drawing them deeper into a rhythm that felt electric. By the next break, the night belonged to him. Klein's absence a shadow to Colbert's light, a victory not just won, but earned through a steady hand that turned the implosion into a master stroke. The final break lifted, and the Late Show studio surged back to life. The air thick with a vibrant hum, the audience a restless tide of energy, their faces alight with the thrill of a night transformed. Stephen Colbert stood at his desk, his stance relaxed yet radiating a quiet triumph. His eyes catching the light with a gleam of satisfaction. A host who'd navigated a storm and emerged not just intact, but elevated. Ezra Klein's fiery exit lingered in the room like a fading echo, but the crowd's focus was locked on Colbert. Their anticipation a steady pulse, their earlier shock now a unified roar of approval, eager to see how he'd seal a night that had spiraled from routine into legend. With the stage his alone, Colbert didn't just close the show, he crowned it, turning a clash into a victory that stood firm and complete. He didn't linger on Klein's absence, didn't milk the drama for easy cheers. Instead, he leaned into the moment with a measured grace, his voice warm yet edged with the resolve that had carried him through the fray. He spoke of conviction, of the courage to face hard questions. His words a subtle nod to the night's unraveling, a reflection on those who crumbled under scrutiny they'd invited. The audience listened intently, their laughter lighter now, thoughtful, as Colbert wove the chaos into a lesson. His humor a gentle thread that tied the tension to a broader truth about power and accountability. He didn't name his departed guest. The point was etched in the empty chair, a silent testament to the host's command. Beyond the studio, the fallout was already a wildfire. Clips of Klein's outburst and exit racing across screens, dissected by viewers and commentators. The internet a churn of reactions, from awe to mockery. The guest's team issued a terse statement, a weak bid to frame his departure as principled. But the narrative had slipped their grasp. Colbert's steady hand shaping it into a rout. On stage, the host shifted gears, bringing out a comedian for a brief set. The laughter a soft balm after the earlier heat, the crowd settling into a rhythm that felt like a collective exhale. Their applause wove through the bit, warm and genuine, the night's edge smoothed into a shared victory they could carry home. As the clock ticked down, Colbert took his final bow, standing alone under the lights, his presence filling the space with an effortless authority. He didn't revisit the clash. His win was in the show itself, a seamless arc from confrontation to closure that needed no encore. He thanked the audience, his tone rich with gratitude, then leaned in with a grin, urging them to stick around for more nights like this, to hit that like button if they'd felt the rush, and to subscribe if they wanted a front row seat to the next big showdown. The room erupted, a standing ovation shaking the walls, a thunderous salute to a host who'd turned a rupture into a rain. The cameras swept wide, catching the crowd, some still buzzing, others beaming, all bound by a tale that ended clean and triumphant. Colbert waved, the sound crashing over him, and the screen faded to black. A perfect cap to a night that stood tall, its echoes sealed with a call to join the ride.